Evening. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Theresa Rajack-Talley, Dalhousie's Vice-Provost for Equity, Inclusion, and Human Rights and Equity Services. Before we begin the program, I must first acknowledge that Dalhousie University sits on the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We are all Peace and Friendship Treaty beneficiaries. We also like to acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and communities who have been here for over 400 years. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We are here to listen to a distinguished group of panelists as they discuss what happened on January 6, 2021 at the US Capitol building. Since witnessing this horrifying incident, one of the most common responses has been shocking, but not surprising. This too has been my response. Not surprising because as I was writing the introduction to my book, Living Racism, in August 2017, white arms-bearing nationalists, Ku Klux Klan members, and neo-Nazis were creating havoc on the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, over the removal of a Confederate statue. Torch-wielding white nationalists marched on the grounds of the University of Virginia on the eve of the planned rally. They shouted, "White lives matter," and alternated chants of, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," and "One people, one nation, end immigration." Several people were injured and one white female, Heather Heyer, was killed by a 20-year-old neo-Nazi supporter who was born in Kentucky, the home of one of our panelists tonight, Senator Neal, and mine for several years. Both Heather and her young killers are far removed from the eras of slavery and Jim Crow. Nevertheless, the racial thinking and hatred of those times never went away, and were part and ever present in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, and we witnessed it again in Washington, D.C. in 2021. It's not surprising that we say it's horrifying and shocking, but not surprising, and hence the title of my book, Living Racism. While some scholars and media pundits and hopeful citizens were eager to think that the election of a Black president in Obama was a sign that the US is a post-racial society. Truth be told, it never was. What happened on January 6, 2021 shows instead that now some people are proud and emboldened to the extent that they no longer feel that they have to hide behind the white sheets. Varying responses from representatives in Congress and everyday Americans are mixed, reflecting a diversity of racial ideologies within and across racial and ethnic groups manifested in chants, Black Lives Matter, simultaneously with White Lives Matter and Make America Great Again. We also witnessed the mixed ideologies among American citizens in the Black Lives Movement, where we witnessed large numbers of white Americans out front in the marches, and again when they voted for President-elect Biden. I write in my book, for those who say, this is not the American I know, do not know the US political and racial history. For African Americans, persons of color, non-Christians, immigrants, and others who have been historically marginalized, what happened in Charlottesville and what happened in DC last week is the America they know. This is not the first Trump or Trumpism that the US have experienced. American history is filled with politicians who have mounted and mounted similar hatred with similar outcomes and a disdain for the constituents if it threatens their white power. As far back as the 1900s, South Carolina Democratic Senator Benjamin Tillman, in popularizing his racial beliefs, is quoted saying, "To hell with the Constitution if it prevents us from lynching." We are here tonight to debate how can this be and will it continue? And what is the impact for Canada? We are already experiencing a local debate on Biden's intent on stopping the Keystone Pipeline. Which America will Canada and Canadians align with? Before I introduce our distinct panelists, there are a few housekeeping notes. First, we will be inviting our guest speakers to join in accordance with the program. Everyone's camera, as you can see, and microphones have been turned off to ensure that only our guests are on the screen. Unfortunately, we do not have a chat feature for this event, but you can ask a question using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The questions are being monitored and would be answered accordingly. Since this is a virtual event, there are possibilities that we will have technical difficulties. We ask that you be patient with us. We have 5 extremely qualified and exciting panelists. We will start with Senator Gerald Neal, who is a successful lawyer and represents the 33rd District in Kentucky, State Senator in Frankfort, Kentucky. He was elected in 1989 and has since served consecutive terms. He formerly served as the Senate Democrat Caucus Chair from 2014 to 2016 and was the first African-American elected to the leadership position in the Kentucky General Assembly in the history of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He currently serves on several Senate and state committees. Over the years, Senator Neal has served as an adjunct professor at the University of Louisville in the departments of public policy, law, political science, and Pan-African studies, teaching courses in history, state and local government, health and welfare policy, civil rights, and the law. He has received many honors and recommendations for his distinguished service to the community, the legal profession, and as a Kentucky state legislator. Among those honors are his induction into the Kentucky Civil Rights Hall of Fame and the Gallery of Great Black Kentuckians. We then have Dr. Rachel K. Brickner, is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at Acadia University, Wolfville, Canada. She teaches in the area of comparative politics. Her research focuses on the intersection of workers' activism and citizenship, with a particular focus on women, migrants, and public sector workers. Her current research focuses on feminist care ethics and education activism in US and Canada. Then we have Dr. Lissa Skitolsky, is the 2020-2021 Simon and Ritva Spatz Visiting Chair in Jewish Studies here at Dalhousie. Her research is in the fields of continental philosophy, aesthetics, and genocide studies, and aims to interrogate our cultural and political responses to state-sanctioned violence. Her forthcoming book with Lexington Books Publishers, titled Hip Hop as a Philosophical Text and Testimony, Can I Get a Witness?, concerns the importance of underground hip hop culture as a form of wisdom and political practices. We have from one of our neighboring universities as well, Dr. Alex Khasnabish is a writer, researcher, and teacher committed to collective liberation living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, on unceded and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. He's an associate professor in sociology and anthropology at Mount St. Vincent University. His research focuses on the radical imagination, radical politics, social justice, and social movements. His recent books include What Moves Us, The Lies and Times of the Radical Imagination, co-authored with Max Haven, The Radical Imagination, Social Movement Research in the Age of Austerity, co-authored with Max Haven, and Insurgent Encounters, Transnational Ethnography, Activism, and the Political, co-edited with Jeffrey Durst. Last but not least, we will have, bringing up at the end, Dr. Isaac Sami, who's the director of the Transition Year Program at Dalhousie University. It's a groundbreaking program established in 1970 to redress the educational barriers and injustice that confront the Mi'kmaq Nation, other Indigenous people, and the African Nova Scotia community. His teaching and scholarship encompasses Africa, the Caribbean, the US Civil Rights Movement, Cuba, and Black Nova Scotian history. He's the author of the acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, and is currently finishing one called Africa's Children Return, Cuba, Africa, and the Apartheid Ends. He's a longtime community activist and participant in the anti-war movement and the anti-racist struggle, and is the co-chair and national spokesperson for the Canadian Network on Cuba. Thank you, panelists, for being here. I will now invite each one at a time, who will give us some opening remarks of 10 to 12 minutes. And at the end of all the presentation, we will open up for Q&A. So I would like to start with our guest to Canada, all the way from Louisville, Kentucky, Senator Gerald Neal. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you have 1,000,001 things to do, several forums, but you agreed to be with us tonight. So thank you, and the floor is open for you, Senator Neal.
Well, first of all, Dr. Rajack-Talley, thank you so much for the university and particularly your invitation to be here. I'm delighted to take part in this panel and hope that I can contribute in a way that's meaningful. Let me say that in order to get into this question, as I understand it, Trumpism, whatever that entails, and what does that mean to our future? That's where I will frame this. I think you have to go back and really look at who this individual is, because he has some characteristics that are very unique, but very predictable when you understand them. And I think the predictability of this individual has been underscored by some, but actually missed as sort of an aside by others. And I think it's central to what Trumpism is, and this actor in a framework, a historical framework, which I will try to frame one. And then at the end of it, give you my opinion, insights as to where this thing might be going. And hopefully we can get to other questions as we go along. So I think you got to start with the fact that this individual was raised a certain way by his father, and the types of things that he prepared him for were sort of insular to other things that were happening in, I guess, a person's normal childhood. He was being prepared to exploit his environment the way his father designed it. But becoming older, his father put him under the tutelage of Roy Cohen, who was the well-known individual that was the chief counsel for the Un-American Activities Committee under McCarthy, during the McCarthyism back in 1954. But he went on in terms of his legal career to actually becoming known as a very unscrupulous individual that employed tactics that were unsavory at times, et cetera. This was a type of training that Trump was purposefully put under as he was evolving as a young man and engaging in the business community, particularly around issues of real estate and so forth. The thing that I think that folks have to understand about him as reported is that this training was reflected in the way he dealt with his environment. And part of that training was associated with, and one observer indicated, this individual has no moral center. You know, if you don't have that rudder, if you don't have that moral center, you can do just about anything without anything inhibiting what direction you might go into. And I think that's what gets to this point about, as of recently, he's been fact-checked with actually committing over 30,000. Can you imagine this? In the past 4 years, 30,000 misleading statements and are outright lies during this period. That's extraordinary in and of itself, particularly when you would see him do this in real time and within short time frames at the same sitting. It was extraordinary until we begin to understand that he has a methodology to what he does, and it's very predictable. For instance, if he's dealing with someone and they have a good attribute and he perceives them or they're juxtaposed to his position, then what he would do is take that attribute and assign it to him immediately and reinforce it and repeat it over and over again. If you looked at him and ascribed a bad or a negative, I guess, observation of him, of his activities, then he would take that and he would give that to the person that he's juxtaposed himself with. This went over and over again. I used to mark this thing down. I said, this is extraordinary, but it was very predictable because what he does and what my observation was and is that if you say yes, he's going to say no. If he says yes, he loses the argument. But if he says no, he's in the argument. Then it's a matter of what tactics that he employs. And if you observe his actions over the years, and those that I know that knew him in New York, this has been confirmed over and over again. And you've heard the term, his methodology is transactional, basically meaning that whenever he does anything, he's trying to figure out what he's going to get out of that. And I think that's been reflected over and over again. So if you take those characteristics and you think about the methodologies that I just discussed, this is how he functions. And if you think about it, you can almost predict his behavior. And I used to chuckle with me and my wife about, okay, here's what he's getting ready to do. And we would hit it on the money almost every time. So he also takes advantage of an environment of chaos. If it's something that's sequential or something that one thing leads to the other, well, that doesn't offer an opportunity. So he creates chaos where there's not chaos in order for him to function. So all the predictable actions that you would think would be undertaken, or the dynamics you would expect, they get squirreled around a little bit, and then he gets into the fight. He's in the situation where he can operate. And that's very important, particularly when you're in a position of power and influence. And of course, the US presidency is one of those. He also uses the device, I would say, that of compromising his opposition. In other words, his opposition, as he looks at it, is either he's going to characterize them in a term, in a way that discredits them, or some way to make them the villain. And if you notice, he's done this gratuitously all the way through our observations in mass media. So I think it's important to understand who you're dealing with and who's functioning in the period, the historical period we're talking about. He creates the context and the framework, just to mean, by that I mean maintaining, for instance, falsely accusing youth in the New York assault early on still needed to be punished even after they were found not to have committed the crime. He insists that they must be punished. Or the way he characterized President Obama as not being born in the country. This was contrived. This was a framework to gain leverage and to identify with certain bases of operation. And this whole idea of building the wall. Building the wall was actually a symbolic and visual piece in real time of separating, of dealing with this issue of the changing demographics that unnerves a lot of Americans, not just along that border, but in other areas in the United States of America. And what he was doing in real time was making them the villains, the live villains that he was protecting his base or whoever would identify him from. So that sets up this whole thing that culminates into what they have referred to as the big lie. What does he do? When he is challenged, or when he's challenged in terms of the election, the big lie emerges. It didn't emerge after the election, actually emerged before the election. He maintained, well, if I don't win, then there must have been fraud. Now think about that. I've rarely heard that, but he set the predicate before that election. And then of course, after the election, he used the big lie, even though the individuals that were dealing or in control of the mechanics of the voting process were of his own party and had supported him diligently up to the point. So he really had no point, but he had something else that was really important. And that was he had that base that he nurtured, that 34% that went somewhere between the 32 and the 39, sometimes would bump up to 45. He would add and subtract, but he always had that 32 to 34% base. And that's who he played for. That gave him his platform and his leverage. The United States of America, among other things, was built on a foundation of enslavement and exploitation of Africans in America. We know that. That legacy of race has fit in structurally in a way in its institutions and over racist behavior, reflecting and maintaining a white supremacist ideology. We know that. The country is a nation of immigrants and is constantly in transition. I already spoke of the how this has unnerved many who see them being challenged in this particular regard. And this iteration of immigrants is most reflected in mostly brown and Black people at the US border and Central America. So you can see that this relates back to the symbolic pieces of division that he employed in the way he undertook what he was trying to do to gain position. This presents a perfect playing field for Donald Trump in terms of his personality, in terms of his methodology and interests that is supported by various groups that enable him, supporting the interests, his particular interests. So to this group, truth sounds like hate to those who hate truth. So he found him a nice little group there, and he consolidated that base. We talking about the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the evangelicals that had that one issue that they had to embrace, the militias that have been organized, QAnon. Voltaire, I believe it was Voltaire who said, those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Well, this is that coming home to roost. The big lie, health, Latinos, the legitimacy of the election itself. You put those together, this was part of his playing field. And if it was not for Georgia, if it was not for getting the 50-50 in the US Senate, there would be very little to check him. And ultimately, it will boil down to time, I believe, and public opinion. So the challenges that lie ahead. What we're witnessing, I believe, are the dying throes of white supremacy. I believe this is what happens when anyone perceives themselves as against the wall and they feel that the only thing they can do is fight back, no matter how rationally or irrationally this might be manifested. The demographic changes will change the nature of our relationships, the social fabric, and present opportunity to realize the so-called more perfect union that the Constitution suggests. The ultimate outcome I cannot project, but white supremacy will yield to this reality, I do believe. The policy initiatives will aid in the progression as we go forward, but make no doubt about it, we're going to be challenged ultimately because these groups are organized, they have enablers in and outside of government, they are trained to function strategically and tactically. There is more to come. You can count on that. Trump will still have leverage, although waning, and how Biden's efforts are translated into reality and address more expectations and needs, I think is going to be very important here. And also how the Republican Party in a two-party system resolves exactly who and what they are. So thank you for that.
Thank you for Senator Neal, and thank you for sticking to your time. We will now have Dr. Rachel Brickner, the Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Acadia University. Dr. Brickner, welcome to Dalhousie.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be here. When we got and I might build on a few things that Senator Neal spoke about, but when I first got the invitation, the thing that really stuck out to me in terms of the title Trumpism, and the struggle for the future was the latter part, the idea of the struggle for the future. And in part, that's because my own research and my own work is on social movements and activism, as you heard in the introduction. So what I want to do is actually talk a little bit about, first about what I consider to be Trumpism, and then how I think that's part of a larger problem in the United States about anti-democratic politics, and then what one way we might consider an antidote to anti-democratic Trumpist politics. So to start, I'm just gonna define Trumpism as a political process, or perhaps a political project, that is fundamentally anti-democratic, not only in the sense of violating norms in order to advantage the Republican Party, but really abandoning partisanship and really replacing that with fealty or loyalty to Trump himself, to the person. And Senator Neal gave us a very good idea of who that person is and what motivates him. Trumpism is a political project that mobilizes a sense of white grievance. It's fueled by a disconnect from truth and perpetuated through media and social media and the right-wing media ecosystem. And it's disconnected from any sense that government should serve the common good or the public good, and it's often accurately summed up by the journalist Adam Serwer's observation that Trumpism is defined by the expression, the cruelty is the point, which might explain some of the policies at the border. But Trump, as many people have pointed out, Trump is not a new phenomenon, and he didn't emerge out of nowhere. And this kind of politics is layered over a politics where actors are already engaged in really anti-democratic actions. So what we've seen in the last decades is a deeply cynical and partisan process by which there are, primarily on the part of the GOP, in which there are lots of violations of what the political scientists Levitsky and Ziblatt call the norms of mutual toleration, which is the recognition of the opposition party's right to be engaged, their right to win elections, their right to exercise power when they win elections. And we see that this norm violated through things like racially motivated voter suppression policies. And another violation of norms that Levitsky and Ziblatt focus on is the violation of the norm of forbearance, which is the idea that even when you have power, you don't use every single power you have, because that perpetuates a vicious cycle in which, well, I'm gonna push you to the limit, and then the next time the other party is gonna push the other party to the limit, and we no longer have a democratic politics. So when the Republican Party rams through a Supreme Court justice or denies Obama a Supreme Court justice, or when at the state level, Republican legislatures facing a newly elected Democratic governor ram through legislation in the lame duck session that restricts the incoming governor's power, that's violating the norm of forbearance. So these kind of norms of these anti-democratic practices have been ongoing or have predated Trump, but Trumpism adds this layer. So I think that when I think about the struggle for the future, it's really about, in part, reclaiming democratic practices and reclaiming a sense that the government should actually work for the common good and reflect equitably the people. Okay, so what I want to talk about for the remaining time is some examples of how that's actually already in process. So I think the struggle for the future, in part, looks a lot like what's already going on. So here's a story that intertwines two disparate movements that have had a tangible effect that we actually saw play out on January 6th as well. In 2012, Shannon Watts saw the Sandy Hook shootings in Connecticut, and she responded to the Sandy Hook school shooting by starting a Facebook group, which grew into the organization Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. And over time, Moms Demand established chapters in all 50 states, and they engage in all sorts of actions. They lobby for what they call gun sense legislation. They support gun sense candidates. They put pressure on businesses, and Moms Demand volunteers have also started running for office. And Moms Demand, importantly, has been a foil to the National Rifle Association, outspending them in campaigns in 2018 and 2020. And for anybody who's paying attention, the NRA has recently declared bankruptcy. So that's something. In 2014, different organization, the New Georgia Project, was founded by Stacey Abrams with the aim of transforming Georgia politics and the fortunes of Democrats in the state by thinking about how do you bring in people who haven't been contacted by campaigns? How do you bring in people who feel alienated from the political system? So she started an organization that made outreach to eligible voters who had been ignored by traditional politics. So she reached out to young people, to people of color, to unmarried women, brought them onto the voter rolls and said, hey, you have a role to play in this democracy. Now, one of the first special elections after Donald Trump was inaugurated in 2017 was Georgia's 6th congressional district, because Trump had tapped the representative, Tom Price, for his cabinet. And a runoff election was held between the Republican, Karen Handel, and the Democrat, Jon Ossoff. And Handel won 51.8% to 48.2%. But Ossoff was fueled by this activism of women volunteers who'd all of a sudden realized, oh my God, Donald Trump was elected. And you saw this wave of women's volunteering after the inauguration. And this activism plus a shifting electorate suggested that, oh, hey, this Georgia congressional map could change. Now, in 2018, a Moms Demand activist whose name is Lucy McBath, who'd lost her son in a shooting, actually won Georgia's 6th district. So a Democrat picks up that seat that John Ossoff had lost. Stacey Abrams narrowly lost her race for governor, and then went forward by founding another organization called Fair Fight Action that was dedicated to contesting voter suppression that had derailed her campaign. And then fast forward to this current election in 2020, thanks to the work of the New Georgia Project, other organizations like Black Voters Matter, who mobilize voters of color, McBath was reelected. Biden won the state for the first time since 1992, and then John Ossoff and the Reverend Raphael Warnock, who were running collectively on this agenda called Health, Jobs, and Justice, won Georgia's 2 Senate races. And Warnock became the first Black senator from Georgia in American history. And there's other important social movements like this throughout the United States. So in 2012, the Chicago Teachers Union started a new kind of education organizing that spurred on teachers unions throughout the country, and nearly a decade of teachers activism throughout the United States has pushed the Democratic Party to back away from market-oriented approaches to public education. And we see that in Biden's policies and his commitment to public education. The Poor People's Campaign, led by the Reverend William Barber, has picked up the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, organizing to build a multiracial organization that shifts the moral narrative about policy priorities in the United States, demanding that, to quote from their website, the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, and the war economy and militarism, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism all be ended. And the Poor People's Campaign has organized direct actions, drafted a policy agenda, and mobilized poor and low income voters to be, or people to be agents of change. So what are the lessons here when we think about the struggle for the future? I think the struggle for the future is a long game, but organizing that has been going on for years has been transformative. And we have seen in this particular election tangible results. The morning of January 6th, I woke up and I was super excited because it looked like Warnock and Ossoff were going to shift the balance of power in the Senate. So I think a lot of people were super excited about that. And then January 6th played out differently. But this just shows that there's all sorts of, there's the Trumpian stuff, but then there's also these other really important democratic movements happening at the same time. This is organizing that is multiracial or explicitly centers the legacy, the agency of Black, Brown, and Indigenous Americans. It's not unimportant that in the Georgia runoffs, the Democrats ran on a platform of health, jobs, and justice, real tangible things, whereas their Republican competitors focused on demonization of the radical leftist socialist agenda. Countering Trumpism means moving beyond cultural battles and angry slogans, but actually tackling critical public policy issues. And we know that reaching people one-on-one, whoops, that's my timer. Sorry. So we know that reaching people one-on-one is a really important policy way to connect people politically. And that means investing early and often. And it also means that we all have a role to play because all of us can get involved and all of us have the capacity to have one-on-one conversations. So when we think about the struggle for the future, all of us have a role to play. And I'll just finish by asking us all to think about what are the things that we can do as individuals to support democratic practices. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brickner, and thank you for your time. It was on target with mine. So we'll quickly move to Dr. Lissa Skitolsky, who is the Simon Riva Spatz Visiting Chair in Jewish Studies. Lissa, they can turn on your microphone and video camera.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here. Those were two really great talks. I'm going to contribute to them by focusing on a different aspect of Trumpism that I think is critically important to make more progress, but also to better diagnose the problem of why anti-democratic movements are so appealing and emotionally satisfying to such a large cross current of white Americans. And it does feel, even though progress has been made, there are these other fringe groups like QAnon, which are just seemingly like growing more popular, and that I do think are an enduring threat to our democratic process. And I'm gonna switch to the Capitol riot for a minute and just talk about how shocking that is. And I think actually that the most prominent images of those who attacked the Capitol and terrorized members of Congress have provided a very misleading view of the large cross-section of the thousands of Americans who traveled to DC in order to participate in the Stop the Steal protest in an effort to prevent the transition of power to our democratically elected president. I also think the most widely circulated images lead us to overlook that the riot was supported and facilitated by law enforcement officers, veterans, military personnel, and Republican lawmakers, and that the rally drew together a wide variety of different interest groups that are invested in different disinformation networks, who nevertheless found common cause in this protest. There are two questions that I'm going to briefly address tonight, with help from the German Jewish philosopher Ernst Cassirer and the French psychoanalyst Octave Mononi. And the first question is, why are all these false beliefs so appealing to so many white Americans? And the second question, why are Americans who do not identify as racist content to align themselves and march right next to avowed Nazis and white supremacists? I think it's helpful to think about the appeal of Trumpism in terms of the emotional appeal of beliefs, as opposed to the intellectual appeal of judgments based on facts. This distinction has been helpful to me in my research about the sensibility of the so-called ordinary Germans who joined the Nazi Party, and I think it is helpful now to better assess the psychoanalytic dynamic of belief and understand why those who support Trump cannot be dissuaded with appeal to facts or logic. To me, it's not enough to say, oh, they don't listen to logic. Why? What is going on there? As well as to consider what all these different groups have in common, or how their beliefs all serve to protect whiteness, whether or not they are members of groups who identify as white supremacists. So Cassirer escaped the Nazi regime, and his last book was titled Myth of the State, which he published in 1946, in which he argued that Nazism is the first expression of a new political technology based on the cynical appropriation of myth and ritual as techniques used to mobilize the masses to mass murder. Cassirer explains that historically, myth represents a state of consciousness and a form of life before the formal separation of the real and the ideal, a time when gods walked the earth and took human form. And it is the separation between what is real and what is ideal that allows for the possibility of abstract critical thought. Cassirer claims that Nazi ideology represents a modern political myth, whereby, quote, myth was no longer a free and spontaneous play of imagination. It was regulated and organized, it was adjusted to political needs and used for concrete political ends. Cassirer explains every aspect of Nazi culture in terms of the political appropriation of myth to secure compliance and devotion. In relation to Nazi rallies and gestures, he says, quote, "The effect of these new rites is obvious. Nothing is more likely to lull asleep all of our active forces, our power of judgment and critical discernment, and to take away our feeling of personality and individual responsibility than the steady, uniform, and monotonous performance of the same rites." He also claims that in order for the Nazis to force this reversion back to mythic consciousness, quote, "The first step that had to be taken was a change in the function of language, where the magical use of the word to produce effects and to change the course of nature takes precedence over the semantic use of the word to describe things or relations of things." I think Kassira's analysis is really helpful to think about why Trump rallies and catchphrases have seemed to exert such a totalizing hold over his followers, and why it is appealing for such a large cross-section of white Americans to ditch any sense of individual responsibility through their identification with a group or race that is fighting for its very survival. In his article, "I Know Very Well, But All the Same," Manoni explains that the dynamic of belief is problematic because, unlike a judgment that is made about experience in light of certain facts, a belief does not only not depend upon experience, but also does not exist without conscious recognition of the fact that all experience speaks to the contrary of one's belief, such as our belief in God, which is only strengthened by the fact that we never receive empirical evidence of divine presence. So a belief in something is tied to the refutation that proves its untruth. I know very well, but, and gains its hold over the psyche only through this refutation. In other words, belief is powerful precisely to the extent that it does not cohere with reality. An example of the politicization of belief prior to Trump occurred in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 with the widespread belief in Iraq's weapons of mass destruction right before the 2003 invasion. The less evidence the inspectors found to verify their existence, the stronger our belief that they actually existed. So we can say, I know very well that they haven't found any evidence of WMD, but all the same, I know they are there. Or in the case of the Stop the Steal movement, I know very well that there is no evidence of election fraud, but all the same, the election was stolen. A belief is based on, bound up with its own disavowal, insofar as it hasn't borne itself out in reality. And this paradoxically reinforces its truth. This seems to capture something about the psychological appeal and the psychodynamics of the QAnon movement and every single type of conspiracy theory that has emerged over the past 4 years to promote beliefs about Trump and his agenda that are so patently contradicted by his words and actions. Manoni also observes that it is difficult to grasp a subject's beliefs because they are often, if not always, attributed to others. Quote, "It is as if we live in a world in which certain beliefs are in the air, even if no one will admit to having them." So I think what's significant here is the role that belief plays in, one, deferring the relevance of the truth at all to the way that one does make sense of the world, and in two, deferring the need for any sort of self-examination or critical reflection about the possible limits of my knowledge. My research in critical race theory indicates that both of these forms of cognitive deferral are also patterns of white sensibility that we can understand as two types of white refusals that are particularly important to the reproduction of whiteness. One, the refusal to think about being white or what it means to be white, socially, economically, politically, psychologically, in relation to those who are not white. And two, the refusal to consider any possible limits to my perception or understanding of the world as a white person. These refusals or patterns of cognitive deferral work in accord with an entire framework of assumptions and discursive practices by which and through which white people perceive and interpret the world in ways that distort and minimize and justify state violence against Black citizens. I think the emotional appeal of all of the false beliefs held by Trump supporters is that they reinforce and give new force to these two refusals that consistently undermine the possibility of any real dialogue about race in America. Though it may seem paradoxical to claim that avowed white supremacists do not think about being white, they actually identify with a myth about whiteness that prevents the ability to think critically about being white in a society that is organized around the subordination and criminalization of non-white communities. When I think about it this way, it's also clear that we have failed to provide American citizens with the tools they need to identify the difference between belief and judgment, given that the version of American history taught in schools and sanctified in our national narratives is also based on the myth of white exceptionalism and the denial of even the most basic facts of American slavery and the forms of state-sanctioned violence that arose after the Civil War to sustain white supremacy over capital and power. In this sense, the 1776 report released by the Trump administration is actually not so different than what I was taught in school. Actually not different at all. Given the rapid transformation of political discourse into hate speech, incited by beliefs that deter the possibility of critical thought, I have personally lost faith in the power of dialogue to communicate across differences. Instead, I think that the most powerful forms of political resistance often occur with aesthetic interventions that can appeal to a sense of shame or empathy that is also impaired by the white refusal to do and believe anything in order to avoid thinking about being white. I also just want to say one thing, a slight correction. My book is now out. It's available for purchase. And it's called Hip Hop is Philosophical Text and Testimony. And it's also a huge response to the past 4 years by thinking about privileging the poetic testimony of Black artists to, as white people, better understand these limits. And the book launch is this virtual book launch is also a hip hop benefit show to benefit the local nonprofit Youth Art Connection. And it's this Thursday night from 7 to 9 on the Dal calendar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lissa, and very good use of your last minute in there. Okay, so next we have from our neighboring university, Mount St. Vincent University, Dr. Alex Khasnabish, and you have your 10-12 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers, first of all, for inviting me to be here, and thanks to everybody in attendance for being a part of this discussion. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen with you, actually, and I have some images I would like to share and some text as well. So my talk today is entitled "Don't Mourn, Accelerate," which plays on the familiar social justice activist slogan, "Don't Mourn, Organize," the end of the Trump era and the future of the far right. And what I want to talk about today specifically is about the bleeding edge, the furthest right of the right, and how they are responding to Trump's leaving office, to the events of the Capitol riots, and also to I think to perhaps challenge some of the narratives that I've seen coming out, especially out of mainstream media ever since the riots, suggesting that Trump supporters went too far in breaching the Capitol, that this was a fundamental error, that this is going to result in the demobilization of their struggle, their movement, and an end to this nightmare that some people see the last 4 years as having been. And I think there's an important corrective to be offered to that, and several important lessons that we need to be aware of on both sides of the border. Indeed, I would suggest across the liberal democratic global north, especially given the rise of fascism and far-right politics recently. So just a quick warning about the content you're going to see to follow. I'm going to show you some posts and images from Telegram, which is an encrypted messaging app that come from far-right sites. So there is far-right content of all kinds of extreme varieties there. So a warning essentially about hate speech. So I think the first thing that we need to understand is that the right wing, obviously, I'm sure as many of you know, isn't divided up neatly into one or two categories. We're talking about a spectrum of organization and belief. And as I said, I'm interested, my research currently focuses on fascists, white supremacists, white nationalists, and the farthest right. The tendency I'm going to talk about today is what we would call accelerationists. This is a segment of the far right that actually seeks to not to resolve the crises of contemporary liberalism, neoliberalism, liberal democracy, but to deepen them as a route to essentially to fascism, to certainly for some to a white ethno state, to a destruction of the order as it is. So this deepening of the crisis has been a long-term goal of the insurrectionist and more recently the accelerationist far right. And the posts I'm going to show you in a minute clearly reflect the fact that there are many actors on the far right today who actually celebrated not only the events of January 6th, the breaching of the Capitol, but celebrated its failure in a certain kind of way. And celebrate the failures of Trump and his cult of personality, in that they feel it's opened the door to recruitment of a much wider base in America. And I think this is one of the signs we have to heed right now, actually on both sides of the border. This is very much an issue in Canada as well. We're seeing the same kinds of groups mobilized, the same kinds of political ideologies, the same kinds of networks being mobilized. And it speaks to a crisis of liberalism, liberal democratic practice, and especially the failures of liberal democratic politics to address the inequalities, exploitation, and oppression that's nurtured under capitalism, under racial capitalism, under capitalism in our current moment. So on this slide, I just have taken a quote, a quick clip from one of the responses following the Capitol Hill riots from one of the Telegram channels, and I'll talk more about them in a second. But you can see the sentiment being expressed here. War reveals the genuine values that are independent of the daily stock market fluctuation of pseudo values: manliness, discipline, overcoming, service and sacrifice, devotion and greatness. Those are the values about which war asks, by which human hearts are measured, affirmed, or rejected. And this really speaks to a broad genre of communication on Telegram, especially its far right media ecology after January 6th, that really celebrated what happened, even though it was regarded as a tactical failure in certain kinds of ways, and certainly not a successful insurrection, but nevertheless another step on the road towards the racial holy war that some of these groups so desperately crave, and certainly a step towards a further deepening of the alienation, of the disaffection that these groups believe white Americans are experiencing. So I've already talked just a little bit, and I mean, I could say a lot more, but for the sake of time, I'll just posit this is one of the essential distinctions we have to understand between what we might call the mainstreaming tendencies of the far right and actors in that camp, and then the insurrectionist tendencies of that far right. And those two groups are fairly distinct and have been for decades. And while the mainstreaming tendency has been somewhat dominant in recent years, and I would argue you could talk about the alt-right as being a manifestation of that mainstreaming tendency, an attempt to go to work in culture, to capture culture in a way that didn't immediately signal to many people a struggle for racial supremacy, white supremacy, with all its freighted signals in relations to fascism and to genocide. We're seeing a turn away from that, and in many ways, the end of Trump's presidency and the beginning of this new political era is being seen as an opening onto a new moment of deepening that crisis and seizing the opportunities it presents. So I think it's really essential to understand that for many actors on the far right, Trump was never their man, regardless of how liberals and others wanted to see him as a figurehead of the far right. He was regarded as a useful tool, certainly, when he served their interests, and he's still regarded as an important figure in terms of drawing people into further right political tendencies. Many scholars, observers, reporters have commented on the mass radicalization we've seen over the last 4 years, at the very least, through conspiracy theories, through the circulation of propaganda, so-called fake news, and other stories through digital media and digital media ecologies. That this is a kind of mass radicalization of white America. Certainly, we've seen a lot of that. I think and the QAnon phenomena is all a part of that. One of the most important things to understand about that dynamic is not that it's primed all of those people for violence, but that it's certainly opened the door for them onto more extreme politics of the right, and leading down the road towards fascism too. So Trump's failures for these accelerationists and the insurrectionists were read as predictable, as expected, and even welcomed, because what they would do is serve to basically wean normal, average, everyday, normie Americans away from the system and convince them of a much more radical path. I've already talked about the alt-right as a mainstreaming attempt, but it's the accelerationist and the insurrectionary wing that's now really taking the lead in this ecology. And I think on this one poster that I've posted here on the left of your screen, the "Trump doesn't deserve you" slogan is a really telling one. So some of the research I've been doing recently has focused on Telegram, the messaging app. For those of you who don't know, Telegram is a privacy-centered, free speech messaging app. It's encrypted, regarded as very secure. The Telegram has been long known as one of the apps most popular amongst the far right. The media ecology, the far right media ecology on Telegram has actually been named Terrorgram, for the fact that many of the dominant channels cross-post, have subscribers in common. It's a very lively and interconnected media ecology. And this is the ecology I've been wading into recently. Subscribers to the channels I'm going to talk about here and to Telegram in general range from the hundreds to the tens of thousands in some of the more popular channels. There has recently, since January 6th, been a purge of Telegram as a result of the violence. Many of those channels remain up and rebranded, so it hasn't gone anywhere. So what I wanted to show you is really a survey of some of the messages that we're seeing on Telegram as a way of pointing to what's going on here. So from one particularly popular far right channel called Black Pilled, writing on January 6th in the immediate aftermath of the riot, all these limp-wristed civnats and conservatives losing their nerve and sounding like a sequel to the vagina monologues called the pussy apologies are the reason we're here in the first place. Grow a pair or get out of the way. Own it. Remember when all those people on the left came out and apologized for BLM and Antifa burning down America for a year straight? Of course you don't, because they aren't a bunch of pussies trying to sell you flashlights and mugs. Followed by a post a few days later. And I mean, obviously there are many, many posts in between, but just pointing some of these things out, talking about how the military is now seen as being on Biden's side. You can't see that image well, but it's a memo from the Joint Chiefs reaffirming support for the democratic process, all this kind of stuff, and throwing Trump under the bus yet again. Just going to show you a couple of other images and messages here. From a different channel, Cryptia. Again, this is on the left, you see an image of a fascist demonstration in Italy, and then Cryptia writes, when political dissolution in America becomes so chaotic and federal persecution becomes so great, the climate of collapse will reach the optimal degree of rapid guerrilla proliferation. Consider now until Inauguration Day your grace period for the last predictable chance to buying anything you need for emergency preparation. And then a poll reflecting the belief that Donald Trump is indeed the biggest accelerationist of 2021. The last couple of images I wanted to show you just by way of of wrapping this up is from a particularly popular channel. Proud Boys have recently moved on to Telegram. So this is from Proud Boys Uncensored, a very popular Telegram channel. And it's interesting because Proud Boys have often been regarded as kind of the street fighting wing of the alt-right. So hardly the hard right that we might be talking about. We're talking about accelerationist neo-Nazis, but nevertheless, we see a distinctly paramilitary and militaristic turn in their posting now, talking here in both these posts about the lines that have been drawn, not just between Democrat politicians and them, but also between everybody on Capitol Hill that day. So this real hardening of an us versus them mentality, a doubling down on the promise of violence and civil war ultimately. And then finally, I wanted to point this out because I think it's particularly interesting. This picture on the right of your screen, it's a eulogy, effectively, to the newest martyr of the far right movement, and this is Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed at the Capitol by security forces there. While she was trying to breach the building. Here from Proud Boys Uncensored, the quote reads, this flag depicts Ashley Babbitt, the martyr who was shot in the neck, represented by the drop of blood. The 4 stars are for the 4 martyrs that were killed at the Capitol. In the background, we have the Capitol where it took place, also red with the blood that was spilled. So there's so much more, I think, to talk about and say here, but I don't want to take up any more time. I just want to say that I think this is one of the most important things we have to pay attention to right now. Biden's inauguration certainly will not put an end to the far right, especially its insurrectionary and accelerationist wing. And in fact, I think over the next few years, we're going to see a real hardening, doubling down of this movement and a real turn towards a directly confrontational conflict with the state and its agents, which we have not seen as much of in places like the United States, especially with state security forces. And I think a time when we have to be very clear about the need indeed to build a broad movement that is anti-fascist in neighborhoods and communities, in workplaces, not just relying on the apparatus of the state or the courts to keep us safe from this threat. So I'm going to stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will remind people to stay tuned because we have a lot of interesting questions coming up for the panelists. We will now have Dr. Isaac Zaney. Dr. Zaney, you have your 10 to 12 minutes. I'm going to keep tabs on you because you know that you can talk for the full 2 hours.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished thinkers and speakers. And also, I think some very rich ideas have been shared with us. Before I sort of share the ideas which I want to talk about, which is sort of to place this crisis in sort of like a historical and international context, I think the underscoring of the fact that North America, in the United States and Canada, colonial settler states that have provided the crib in which capitalist relations have developed, clearly undergirded the resurgence and the strength and the fact that white supremacy happens to be a very profound social relation that undergirds both of these societies. And when I was listening to Dr. Skitolsky, I was reminded by Gerald Horne's assertion that the fundamental issue around African-American rights, and Gerald Horne is a very well-known and acclaimed African-American historian who now teaches at the University of Houston. He's an incredibly prolific author. And in his book about the apocalypse of settler colonialism, he outlines very clearly that what we're talking about is not just simply the denial of the rights of African-Americans, but the denial of the right of African-Americans even to have rights. And when one looks at the states that Trump was challenging, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and even Michigan, and of course Arizona, okay? But particularly in those first 4 states I mentioned, those states were won, okay, for Biden by the African-American vote. So in a sense, it's this idea that, yes, he was cheated because African-Americans exercised their limited right of voting under what we might consider bourgeois democracy. And so I think that's a profound point that has not been underscored. This idea of the problematic of whether African Americans can truly achieve citizenship. And he also makes the point, in a sense, when we talk about Nova Scotia, where we have a long-standing African Nova Scotian population in which my roots lie, he speaks about the fact that when people talk about Crispus Attucks, when they talk about the American War of Independence, and Africans extol people of African descent who fought on the rebelling colonist side against British rule, they're extolled. They forget that a vastly greater number of people of African descent fought with the British against what perhaps has been described by many as a counter-revolution to defend slavery, and eventually ended up coming to Nova Scotia. And he talks about perhaps a deep ingrained memory of what the white supremacists who underscored the founding of the United States would see as a great betrayal. And I think that's an important historical thing to underscore. What I really want to talk about and sort of underscore here, and very quickly, and perhaps we can explore it further in questions, is that the crisis of January 6th underscored a very deep crisis that had been developing not only in the world system, but in the American system, and particularly American capitalism. We face perhaps 5 clear crises. There's obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, which has laid bare the nostrums of neoliberalism, which has demonstrated that the entire social security net, the so-called welfare state, has been buried in a coffin, because with the hollowing out of the state and the public sector by neoliberalism, privatization, and so forth and so on, the US healthcare system has been unable to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, we've seen the criminally negligent response with some people when one looks at the disproportionate deaths of African Americans and other people of color, the criminal negligence, even genocidal indifference of the Trump regime. We also have the economic crisis, where people are facing evictions, people are facing hunger, people are facing being thrown out into the streets to fend for themselves, while billions of dollars, okay, and close to over billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, exceeding even the $1 trillion limit, have been given so lavishly to corporations, while the kind of aid that people who are poor and who are working class would have needed just to survive on a day-to-day basis has been denied them. And some people witnessed the debate in the US Congress over even giving the $2,000 check, okay, or assistance. So there's that economic crisis. And of course, while all this was going on, it was very interesting that this grotesque $700 billion budget to the US military was passed very easily with bipartisan support in the US Congress. There's also the ecological crisis, the climate crisis that we face. And there's a recent report by the National Academy of Sciences, for example, that underscores the ecological catastrophe that looms. 1 to 2% of all insects are dying off on an annual basis. And this is a tremendous threat, not only to life on this planet, but to the existence of humanity. And there's also the danger of war, of international conflagration. We all stood with bated breath, wondering if a conflagration would emerge that would plunge the world into a conflict that would make the world wars pale in comparison. And of course, there's the political crisis. It's become very clear that the existing political arrangements by which different sections of the ruling circles were able to sort out their differences are no longer adequate and now fail to do that. I mean, I think the clearest example of that is not only the January 6th mob riot at the Capitol, it was clearly as well the unprecedented op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post, signed by 10 former secretaries of defense, which called on the United States military not to intervene in the political life, at least in this conflict that had emerged in terms of the fight over who had won the presidential election. In a sense, they were worried that Trump, in terms of the various lies he had promoted about the election being stolen, would somehow manage through various appointments to be able to at least claim, to mobilize a particular section of the Pentagon behind a coup attempt. And this was an unprecedented op-ed. I mean, and many people, it was astonishing because the division between the military, in a sense, being under civilian control in US history, particularly in the US Constitution, was something that was considered sacrosanct. And of course, one of course thinks back to the historical analogy of Chile. In 1973, September 11th, the other September 11th, when Augusto Pinochet staged a military coup and overthrew the democratic elected government of Salvador Allende. Chile had had a long history where the military had been subordinate to the civilian authority. It was embedded in the constitution, and everyone thought the military would never intervene in political life. And so in a sense, there was that fear. And where does this crisis come from? And when one looks at the United States in historical and international context, there has emerged a crisis of global hegemony. The United States emerged out of the Second World War as the dominant political power in the world. And in fact, not only was it the dominant power, not militarily, it was also the dominant economic power. There was the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, which placed the United States at the pinnacle of these financial institutions and the pinnacle of world power. And of course, coming out before the Second World War, there was the New Deal by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There was a Fair Deal of Truman, followed by then there was a Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson. All of them is an attempt to bring about social reform and to quell any form of social unrest. And we had the emergence of the civil rights movement. And we had the winning of very significant rights by African Americans. They're proven to be somewhat temporary because fundamental change did not take place in that sense. But there were these concessions. And the United States could afford to do that when it was in the economic ascendancy. But then we begin to see, with the Vietnam War, a significant decline in the United States to fund social projects at home in order to combat inequality, in order to promote advancement of certain groups that had been disadvantaged, in order to accommodate the struggles and the demands of those who had been the most exploited and oppressed. That no longer was possible as the US economy began to decline. And so what we begin to see, and what Trump, in a sense, is both an aberration but a reflection of, is an assault on the welfare state, sort of what can be described by some as a counter-revolution within a counter-revolution, when we look at what Trump has done. But this counter-revolution, we're beginning with Reagan from 1981 to 1989 when he was president, and Margaret Thatcher from 1979 to 1990, this attack on the welfare state, this attack on the idea that that people had claims on the society and so forth and so on, the attack on the question of whether people therefore could look to the state for any form of social assistance. So we have the hollowing out of the welfare state. And so when we come to what we witnessed with the accelerating through the Clinton years, through the George Bush years, we face a very significant political crisis. The United States is the strongest power in the world. But at the end of the day, okay, it's declining economically. China is now going to be the largest economy. By 2050, China and India would constitute at least 50% of the world economy. And the US is facing, it's come out in a series of papers written in the Pentagon, both under Obama and under Trump, where they recognize that the US global ascendancy is threatened. And yet they do not have the economic wherewithal to both spend massively on the military, which they have done, and to engage in the kind of social projects at home. And so within this, we have a deep crisis, a deep problem in the US ruling class, okay, which has emerged. Those who want to rule through the constitutional arrangements that have existed, and those like Trump, who believe that a shredding of the constitutional arrangements are necessary in order to assure that the US can meet the ascendant policies. So I think it's important to understand, and I think people have underscored this, we face a very deep crisis here. And I think we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day yesterday. And I think it's only appropriate to sort of underscore that King himself, at the end of his life, understood that it didn't matter which political party was in power. even though we must struggle against the most egregious, shall we say, violations of human rights by those parties, we must have deep, thoroughgoing change in the social and economic system. And I think when we talk about the struggle for the future, we must not, shall we say, consider that Biden will be some sort of panacea. We must look to the kind of struggles that Dr. Brickner was talking about and that others were talking about. These struggles to go beyond just simply the changes of the faces of people in power, but also a fundamental change in the social and economic relations in society. I'll stop there. I've spoken in very general terms, but I think it's important to understand that Trump himself is a unique personality, but he's also a product of a very deep ongoing crisis in US imperialism.
Thank you, Dr. Saney. The questions have coming in. Some of them are very lengthy, some of them are a combination of comments and questions. So what I've done in the essence of time, I have grouped them, and they are in two basic groups. One is focused on the US, one is focused on the impact on Canada. So I'll start with the US, and Senator Neal, I'll start with you, and then anybody else who wants to jump in can do so. Apparently, based on the questions that came in, people are questioning whether there can be a civil war in the US. And linked to those, people ask, had Trump won, what would have happened? Would there be a civil war? And linked to that, people are asking, is the constitution of democracy under threat? Is the rule of law under threat? Is the Electoral College under threat? Is there hope? Yeah, speak. Yeah, microphone is off.
I said that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
I'll start with the last one, and in fact, I'll ask you to give those to me again at some point as we move forward. Just let me start with the last one. Are we under threat in that regard? And I would answer that by saying we are under threat. I think some of the commentary that's been made during this particular panel and commentary that's been made nationally, and anyone that's watching and has any sense of those who have organized to carry out their particular agendas, that they're not going to fade away. And their agendas notwithstanding, Trump being a rallying figure, Trump is not the key to what they do or don't do. And I agree with that. That will continue. I think ultimately, however, that looking at the macro forces that are taking place from a demographic standpoint, I think that they will wane over time, but I think it will get worse before it gets better. And I think we must be prepared to deal with that. And that means when you look and ask the question, who is the enemy? If you think of us holistically, the enemy is us. And we're going to have to deal with that. We can't be naive to this reality. That's that piece. Give me the other two.
The other piece was, is the American Constitution under threat, and can there be a civil war?
Well, you know, I never say something can't happen. Of course, there could be something that could be characterized as conflict, but you know, my take on this is that I don't think that it's going to ultimately end up in what we would call a civil war. There's going to be skirmishes and conflict, as I've indicated. But I think that we're going to be strong enough collectively, and I think the majority of people, and I think the constitutional framework will be embraced sufficiently by enough, as long as we have control of those entities, and if the depth of the operatives within our structures of government, our tools of government, such as our armies and so forth and so on, and National Guard and so forth, if they are not overly tainted, I think we will sustain and we will survive, and I think we will be strengthened. So I think you got to be hopeful, but you can't be naive. You have to root out, you got to identify, and you have to deal with appropriately those forces that are anti-democratic. And we have to hold those responsible accountable for their actions. And I think that's part of the process. But we must also deal with the structural changes, the basic structural changes that are dividing us, that's creating inequities in this society, that's choosing winners and losers in many ways. We're going to have to change the way we do business in society and distribute wealth. And I think that's going to be important. I think it's going to take time. It's going to be a struggle. And I think it's critical. The next 2 to 4, maybe 2 to 8 years are going to be very critical in terms of who's carrying that ball. The comment was made about it doesn't make any difference. I probably misinterpreted this about what party's in the seat. I understand that in the largest sense of the term, but it makes every difference who's in there. If Trump had won this particular election and had a 4-year term, boy, I tell you, I couldn't even take a deep breath just thinking about that. I think we would have been right down the hole. We'd be climbing at it for the next 50 years. But now I think we have a chance. I think there's in terms of what we are going to be, but it will not be we won't be returning to what we were. We're going towards something else. You had another last question?
One other question that was directed to you. You mentioned that there was a prayer that was said in the Senate chamber. And would you like to comment on the role of evangelism and the role of the church in this whole movement, the Trumpism movement?
Well, let me not be timid about this. I listened to the I think it was I can't think of the doctor's name that was talking about beliefs and that sort of thing. She was really hitting a chord with me with respect to that. There are a lot of people who are other directed for some of the observations that she's made, by some of the references she made, by some of those who have been studying those areas. But I think that these people are clearly in that framework. There's just no question about it. I think we're seeing another iteration of those who related to the Tea Party, for instance. I think we see them coming together. These people are primed for the kind of action that they're involved in. And I think we ought to call it what it is. Even down here in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those evangelists was at his church the other day talking about how he was praying for a curse upon those who would fight those who were doing what they were doing in Washington and would not support Trump and that sort of thing. I mean, that's crazy. But it's real because he has a flock of people that believe certain things for some of the complex reasons that have been articulated. So I think that's going to be a problematic area. But I think and I trust that the majority of people, and I think an increasing number of those individuals that are afflicted or affected this way are going to modify their behavior if their grievances, whatever that term might mean to them, are addressed. And I think many of these grievances grow out of the reality that they live of having not being satisfied in terms of what life has given them, where they fit in the political structure, and what their government is in relationship to making those things happen. So if policies change, I think they will have an effect upon a significant number of individuals. It's going to be a difficult piece, but I think I look forward to the challenge myself. So it's going to be interesting to observe and participate in.
Okay, thanks. The next question is to Dr. Saney and Dr. Brickner, but you all could always respond to the prior questions. But this question, and Senator Neal, you could also over time respond to this question. The question is, do you think the appointment by President-elect Biden of having more underrepresented people in his cabinet, is that adequate for him acknowledging the debt he owes to voting for them? And would that impact some of the systemic racism and so on that can be found in the US? Either one could start.
I'll just jump in. I think it's important. There's a lot of literature on the meaning of, a lot of research has been done on the meaning of various kinds of representation. And certainly what you would call symbolic or descriptive representation is critical. So having women, a female vice president, the first Black woman to be vice president, first Black and South Asian woman to be vice president, a very, very diverse cabinet in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of immigration status. There are at least 2 people in the cabinet who are immigrants to the United States. I believe that Biden just appointed today as his an undersecretary or deputy secretary of Health and Human Services or something, a transgender woman. That's all really important from the perspective of descriptive or symbolic representation, because there's the expression, you can't be what you can't see. And so it sends a signal to the broader public, not only that people who share that identity can be that role, can have that position, but also that people who belong to that particular identity group can have power, right? So that's important. It's insufficient. If you're going to address systemic racism or systemic inequalities of any kind, you actually have to tackle the policies that reproduce those inequalities. So you can't, just because it's been on the top of everybody's mind, you can't put a Black person in charge, the current Surgeon General of the United States under Trump is a Black man. That doesn't mean that racial disparities in the medical system go away. That doesn't mean that all of the distrust that Black Americans have towards the medical establishment in the United States disappears. Poof, that only goes away with policies and actions that remedy that kind of those injustices. So you need policy and people.
And I like to say, symbolic representation is critically important. And just what Senator Neal was saying, the defeat of Trump's attempted coup has created a certain space. And the question is whether Biden will respond to that space. And that's the big debate. Biden has been an ambiguous figure, to say the least, are problematic when it comes to certain issues of, advancing very fundamental democratic and human rights. There's a history, he opposed busing, there's a number of different things, but that's in the past. The question is whether this moment, in terms of, dealing with an openly white supremacist president who attempted a coup that led to this unprecedented editorial coming out in Washington Post, whether this creates the space where this government, this administration can be pushed to the left to do progressive things. It's clear, African Americans won Biden even before the election. When he was running through the primaries and he was basically almost dead, African American votes won the nomination for him. It was African American votes. I remember on election night, I was talking to friends in Michigan. I was talking to friends in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, and it was these votes that won him the election. It's clear. Okay, and the question is whether African Americans will, for example, be able to see the fundamental attacks on voter suppression, the fundamental fulfillment of the dream that Martin Luther King spoke about, the fundamental recognition that perhaps African Americans can be citizens at Malcolm X. You often said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Rock landed on us, whether these things are possible. So Manning Marable, the late Manning Marable, often used to speak about the symbolic representation and how often symbolic representation actually didn't lead to fundamental change. These are key questions. And Dr. Brickner spoke about people being mobilized, right? What happened in Georgia, and I was late up with a friend on early hours of the morning following the Georgia elections. So if people have been mobilized in a sense that they can keep that pressure. So one of the issues is, yes, he's been elected. Yes, the coup has been defeated, or whether it was an attempted coup, an insurrection, but now people have to remain putting that pressure on. And in a sense, I want to sort of, close my comments by reading a brief quote from Martin Luther King, who I think, understood that, which party was in power did matter because it depended on whether you can put pressure on, but understood that a much deeper struggle had to unfold. And King himself said, and it's very clear, and he said this in 1967, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation are incapable of being conquered. And we know there are different voices from outside the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party, who are calling for a very progressive agenda, what Senator Neal had spoken about, a fundamental redistribution of wealth and power, right? And perhaps, I am no predictor of the future, we have a space in which this can be accomplished. I think that space wouldn't have existed if Trump had been elected, but this is a space, and I think Biden owes a debt to those, in a sense, who perhaps, thwarted the coup in one way or the other, right? And if one of them, yeah,
we are fortunate enough to have in our panelists,
yeah,
a civil rights fighter, social justice worker, African American, and Democratic Party state senator. So we'll have him respond. We'll put in one on the panel. You have to represent the group.
Well, first of all, I agree with these comments that have been made. There's one thing that we cannot forget, and I don't think we've adequately addressed here, and that is the dynamics of the protests and what it has had. And I think the comment by Dr. Brickner, is that correct? It's correct. I mean, protest alone means nothing. It has to be translated into policy and in order to sustain whatever it is you're trying to deal with. But one thing I've recognized, and I think you all would concede, is that I would agree, is that every progressive step that's been made historically is met by what? A strong, aggressive reaction. And our attempt to moderate or compromise whatever that was. You can look at the civil rights movement in every stage, the Black Power movement. In the age, you can look at what happened even when the Great Society was attempted by Johnson, President Johnson, back in the mid-1960s. The fact of the matter is that it does matter who is in what seat, carrying forth what policies to achieve this. And I think that the protest movement has created a sensibility that I have not seen in decades, that we're not going back. I haven't heard or felt that in decades. The young people I talk to, they are very resolved. I'm still trying to understand some of their stuff, but I'm beginning to understand that they're not going back. And the other thing is that what it's done. I'm in the legislature, right? And I'm talking to legislators all over the country. I'm in the National Organization of Black Legislators. I'm on the executive board. Let me tell you something that is going across this country, is that we're having conversations with the other side, getting back to what Dr. Saney was talking about, that aren't Democrats, that are Republicans. And they have their own objectives in mind, of course, but it has opened up a door for dialogue, discussion, opportunity, and we're going to see where that struggle goes. We're going to see what that outcome is. But I got to tell you, haven't had discussions I'm having like I'm having today. I've had 2 of them today with top leadership type that want to make a change for whatever the reason is. And I'm telling you that there's a dynamism that's happening out here. Do not rule out, I know you're not ruling out, but don't discount the power of the reaction to the George Floyd piece, the Breonna Taylor piece, which is an extension of what goes on historically and what is still going on in this country. It's not going to be tolerated. It's going to be part of this dynamic that we're going to realize change in this country. So we'll see where it goes. We'll fight.
Okay, great. We'll come back to some of the questions on the US, but I want to switch it a little to focus on us. All the panelists, you can put on your cameras, that's fine. Because this can go to anybody who wants to respond. Question about Canada, the questions are kind of two focus in the sense that what is the impact on Canada, including on trade, but Trumpism in general, but also can we attest to having similar racial thinking and movements? So it's the impact, but can Canada admit to having similar kinds of situations and movements? And I'll let, if you want to respond to this, just put on your microphone and I'll try to see if we can do it one at a time. Dr. Saney, I know you want to respond, but I want to give either Lissa or Alex an opportunity if they would like to respond to this, and then we'll come back to you and Dr. Brickner.
This is only my second year here. I have been studying the discourses unique to Canada that allow white people to defer any discussion ever about anti-Black racism, specifically against African Nova Scotians in Halifax. So I can speak about a few strategies that I've observed here. But for the most part, the same problem, like I see the exact same problem with all white Canadians, or a lot of white Canadians, which is again, just a refusal to think about what it means to be white, like in Halifax, in relation to people who are not white in Halifax, right? In terms of like everyday experiences and access and the organization, right, of our social practices to the benefit of white people and their comfort, right, at the expense of everyone else. And I also don't see a real interest in white people acknowledging that there are limits to what they can know about the African Nova Scotian community or what they're subject to or what it feels like to be African Nova Scotian, that there are limits to what they can understand about that as white people. So I see both of those refusals enacted all the time. But of course, the discourse here that I've observed that's unique to Halifax is when I ask a white Canadian from Halifax, like, what do you think of all the racism in Halifax? Like, I wasn't prepared for it as an American. We don't really know that much. They'll say, yeah, sure, but do you know who really has it bad? The Indigenous groups. And it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's just that I very frequently see white people in Halifax invoking the history of Indigenous genocide in order to avoid talking about systemic racism against African Nova Scotians. Also, my own work has really been pushing back against the refusal of scholars in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies to ever use the term American anti-Black genocide. They think it makes no sense. I'm not allowed to use that category at all, right? So my work is now like a critical aesthetics of the term genocide, right? So the way that we have defined genocide and our ontology of genocide as an event doesn't actually historically help us understand the phenomenon of genocide as it plays out. But what it does work to do is make it impossible to think anti-Black genocide, especially impossible to think American anti-Black genocide. So there's similar questions I have here in Canada. How are you defining genocide? And I've read, the two reports on the Indigenous genocide and sort of this great understanding in the second report that came out last year or the year before, that the word has been used, right, cultural genocide, in order to minimize like the history of Canadian violence against Indigenous groups. And so now we're just using the word genocide, which is great. But there is an absolute refusal to think about systemic violence against African Nova Scotians as genocidal violence, right, which targets the entire community as such. There's still just sort of an insistence that individuals get harmed in like tragic accidents and exceptions to the norm, but that every time someone who's African Nova Scotian is killed or harmed or racially profiled, it's an exception to the norm of a just justice system, right? So those sorts of conversations are very, very similar that happen in Canada. And so so I think we need to evaluate how we're allowed to talk about racism, what words we're allowed to use, what words we're not allowed to use, why some forms of violence, some categories of violence, we all, like Canadians, agree are very comfortable, right? Talking about the residential schools as a form of genocide, not anything that's ever been inflicted against African Nova Scotians, like Africaville, right? Why isn't that a form of genocidal violence? Sorry.
So, Alex, I want you to make a comment. What would you say to Canadians and Americans, about Trumpism and the impact of Trumpism here in Canada?
I mean, I guess I would just say we most certainly have the same unresolved, lingering issues here, and they're the consequence of completely unaddressed relations of oppression and exploitation that are structured through the settler colonial history of this place, but also through the dynamics of capitalism. And, fascism gestates inside liberal democracies that are not only unwilling, but largely incapable of actually systematically addressing these group-based, not just inequalities, but injustices. So we're going to keep seeing these same problems because there is no path forward to resolving them within the structure of a system that was meant to deny certain kinds of people access to political power and autonomy. And I mean, I think, this is one of the points I would make about the US election, is that it's sort of being greeted as a return to the halcyon days of the neoliberal order, but that order is gone. That order is gone on a global scale. And so what happens when people who are promised a return to the thing that they thought they were living through before the nightmare don't get it? Like, what kind of resentment does that breed, right? What kind of black-pilled nihilism does that give rise to? And I think, Canada has the very great dubious distinction of being placed next to the United States in the sense that it makes all our crimes look so much paler by comparison. But that goes a long way to overshadowing the very real dynamics of inequality and enduring violence and oppression here against Black people, certainly, but yeah, against Indigenous people. And I think one of the great original sins of this country is settler Canadians' inability to even look at the fact that we occupy unceded, unsurrendered, many of us unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous territory, and to do anything more than render lip service to that. So until these issues are addressed, and I think a path towards collective liberation really meaningfully embarked on, which includes rebuilding some of those democratic institutions that are currently in ruins, you're not going to be able to have this conversation. It's not something that our institutions, which are increasingly threadbare and intentionally so, are going to be able to address. And the real frightening prospect, I think, right now too, is precisely what we're seeing in the United States as a response to this riot, which is the deployment of an increasingly armed and militarized state in order to respond to threats of destabilization. And those threats and that force has always been gleefully used against the left first and foremost. And what frightens me right now is that everybody, or maybe not everybody, but many people are cheering the deployment of 60,000 troops in DC and are cheering Apple and Google deplatforming Parler and talking about Telegram. And while I'm no fan of free speech absolutism, I would say the roads to dystopia are many. And we have to be really careful about the powers we invoke to try and save ourselves from the things we fear, and unintentionally bringing in, if not worse outcomes, then at least as bad ones. Weimar Germany is such a resonant example that in the midst of great liberalism and freedom, you can have incredible and unresolved tensions and conflicts enduring that give birth to monstrosities.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Saney, same question.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, we often hear about US exceptionalism. There's also a Canadian exceptionalism. Now look at what's horrible happening in the United States. This could never happen here. And as both Alex and Dr. Skitolsky outlined, Canada has a history of dispossession, physical and cultural genocide against Indigenous people, the sending of their children to residential schools. It was a slave society. It wasn't simply the place where people were escaping from slavery from the United States, going to the northern states, and then settling in Ontario before the US Civil War. Canada also was a slave society, or the Canadas, until the 1830s. The first recorded race riot in North American history is July 26, 1784 in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. We have resolutions and statements by leading political leaders and authorities that are very anti-Black. We ourselves here have documented at Dalhousie. Lord Dalhousie was Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia from 1816 to 1820. His attempt to physically, his attempt first, because this is a second wave of what we could call Americans, African Americans coming to Canada, more than 2,000 arriving, having escaped from slavery, and Lord Dalhousie wanted to send them back to their former owners. And in fact, when they resisted, he wanted to remove them, deport them to Trinidad and Tobago. We have resolutions passed. We also have we have the Indian Act passed in 1868, which basically further marginalized, disenfranchised, right, and put the colonial boot on the back of the indigenous people. We have the Keep Canada White policy, which was an immigration policy that ran right up until the 60s. We have all of these resolutions. And also it's important to bear in mind, and we have an important anniversary that people don't talk about, coming up this summer in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the 30th anniversary of what was referred to as a race riot here in Nova Scotia that I participated in, right? That was really an attack on the Black community in the North End, right? And I was there till it. And it made international news. This is 1 year before what the Rodney King riots, right? That took place, Rodney King uprising, so to speak, that took place in Los Angeles. So we have a history of this. And we also have a history, as Alex knows, of white supremacist groups. So Calgary is a center of white supremacy in Canada, right? In Nova Scotia, we have, an attempt in 1980s to actually establish the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, and there was resistance to that. We have CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, actively involved in setting up a white supremacy group, Heritage Front, right? We just recently, a few years ago, Bernie establishing the Canadian People's Party, trying to replicate that kind of Trumpism here in Canada, that kind of extreme. So there is that history here. And of course, I also forgot to mention as well, there's a history of de facto segregation in Canada, a mirroring, perhaps the lesser degree of Jim Crow in the US South, particularly in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia wasn't called the Mississippi of the North for nothing, right? Because of the industry and so on. And all of these things, the speech checks and carding. So these things are possible here, right? But to get back to what Alex was saying, at the end of the day, it's collective struggle, right? And I think that when we look back upon 2020 and this time of COVID, to echo what Senator Neal said, we may focus on January 6th, but I think what emerged out of the George Floyd protests, that multi-ethnic, multiracial, broad-based movement was fundamentally transformational in the struggle for a better world. And I think on one level, perhaps deeply frightened US ruling circles, right? Okay, I think in their eyes, it was a threat perhaps that they perceived, much like the struggles in the 1960s by things like the Black Panther and other, African-American struggles.
Right. And so in essence, while the racial ideologies and the movements historically, both in the US and Canada, lived on, right? The resistance and the resilience and the movements against it is transforming. It is expanding and becoming more inclusive. And to a large extent, we have to give credit to social media, because when the hangings and so on were taking place in the rural parts of the countries, it was a certain group that were witnessing and supporting. But now with social media, the white community is seeing what the non-white communities have been experiencing, and that has been imploring in terms of broadening the social movements against all these things. We have a few more.
One thing I'd add to that, Theresa, I think social medias are important, but they have to be connected to real struggles on the ground, because there's a danger in the society of atomization and fragmentization of people, right?
And
what I call
fact,
neoliberalism, struggle against oppression.
Right, and in fact, Trumpism was linked to Twitter, you know, so it goes both ways. We have a few more minutes and people can, give their last words, but I want to defer to our visitor, Senator Neal. You said something in your legislature comments that we put in the Dal News, that what happened on the Capitol was an embarrassment. It was not only a threat to democracy, but was an embarrassment to the US. And the US, real or perceived, is the bastion for democracy in the world. So I would like for you to address that, and then the other panelists could address what this means on the international world scale. One of the question was that what we saw at the Capitol is what we see in other countries. And in fact, when we see this happening in other countries, we see the US has a hand in that. So I will end with that kind of overall philosophical or political question, but in answering, I would like for people to talk a little bit about hope.
Well, Did you say Putin? let, let me say that Trump, somebody referred to him as a unique personality, no question about that. But you know what he was doing was dealing with the world order as well. He was disrupting and disengaging and reconnecting in different ways to change the players of who controlled the economic forces in the world and what the power relationships were going to be. He was trying to do that. He failed miserably because he didn't understand the Chinese investment and the way they see progressing through history and what their mission is, are their minion, North Korea or something like that. And of course, now he played his game with our friend in Russia, Putin. But he also, to do that, he had to undermine the relationships in Europe, which was these are the friends, these are the people, the cohorts with the United States in terms of advancing democracy and democratic principles. So he failed on all of these fronts, except he did hollow out relationships and hollowed out some things internally. So here we come with a situation that he did not anticipate, losing that election. And ultimately what has happened is he had to employ another piece, which was to undermine democracy itself and confront it directly. And by doing so, to this point, he has failed. Now, that doesn't mean it hasn't served some of these groups out here. I think it has. But in terms of his objective, I think it's failed. And those individuals that are out there in the world that look at this most powerful country in the world, this country that's the beacon of democracy and civilization, this exceptional experiment, what? My goodness. Here we are, stormed, just like someplace in Belarus or somewhere. People discard, hiding under tables. People who are wrapping themselves in the American flag and declaring victory over the Constitution, they disregarded it. I mean, it is the ultimate embarrassment for a country that's actually put itself up that way. However, I do think it will prevail ultimately. I believe it's going to be strong. I think the commitment overall is deep, despite the struggles that we're confronted with now, which I think will be long-term, but I think there'll be a win in the end.
Thank you, Senator Neal. So I'll go around the table in the same order. Dr. Brickner, you have 2 minutes. I'm giving everybody 2 minutes. Yeah, speakers off.
Whoops. We should all have that down by now. turning our mic on. I think when I saw throughout the campaign, throughout the Trump administration, and certainly on January 6th, one of the things I thought was, I don't ever want to hear the phrase leader of the free world again. Like that phrase can go out the window. But there's, I think I'll end by going back to one of the first questions that you asked of Senator Neal, and that was in the whole list of questions. One of them was, is the constitutional order dead? And I think I want to just kind of speak to this in two parts, I guess. One is the Constitution is a piece of paper, right? It's a set of principles, it's a structure, it's a framework of governing, and it doesn't mean anything unless the people who are empowered to uphold it give it life. And so that means you have to elect people who are actually going to uphold the principles of the Constitution. And of course, there are aspects of it that are contested. That's why there's a Supreme Court that and justices don't all rule 9-0 on every case. But that's politics. But you actually have to have people who are committed to upholding the Constitution, who are elected to office. And what's happened in the Trump administration is the Republicans in Congress have more or less, with a few exceptions, just abdicated their responsibility. I mean, Congress had already ceded tons of power to the executive, but in the Trump administration, the Republicans really just kind of said, okay, what do you want? I'm afraid of your tweets and I'm afraid of the base, and had really abdicated their congressional responsibilities. So how do you get better people in office? Well, it's really complicated, and the structure of US democracy is complicated, and there are lots of things that tilt the playing field in favor of, say, a tougher time for Democrats to take the Senate with a big majority because of where Senate seats are and all that. But if you're going to elect people to uphold the Constitution, that means you need people who are engaged at the grassroots and mobilizing and organizing and getting good people to run for office, and good people who are going to win in specific locations, because the person who's going to win in Louisville, Kentucky is not necessarily the same person who's going to win in California or Florida or Missouri, right? But there are people who, you have to get people who can win, and then you have to push them with grassroots activism to do the right thing. And so you need both parts if you're going to uphold the constitutional order.
Thank you.
I think, and that's what's going to, then you have the whole anti-fascist part, but that's a whole other part of the equation. But that's what you need in part.
Dr. Skitolsky, you have your 2 minutes, not a similar 2 minutes as Dr. Brickner, as a real 2 minutes.
I'm gonna quickly reiterate what I think a very real obstacle is, that we're all, like, a lot of people just aren't taking seriously enough, and then talk a bit about how I saw this unfold and why I left rural Pennsylvania, and why I just found myself incapable of assuming any authority as a professor at a university where 70% of the student body voted for Trump. The problem is really not self-avowed Nazis, and it is very easy to still see self-avowed Nazis and self-avowed white supremacists and armed militias as a fraction of the United States. That's easy to do. And you could say they're waning, they're on their way out. The problem is that Trump got more votes than any other, on the second election, than any other Republican candidate at any time. And the problem in my moral horror living in rural Pennsylvania were not the dudes I saw who were packing, who I knew were members of militias. It was my next door neighbors, who I had been on the most friendly, kind relationships with, until all of a sudden those Trump signs went up. And my question, did you see the pussy video? Are you seeing the way he's speaking about women? How can you, like, nice people with good values? The answer, I know very well he says some bad stuff about women, and I know very well he says some bad stuff about Black people, but all the same, he's really gonna bring our country in the direction it needs to go in, right? Or all of a sudden, white male students saying to me, if you think it's okay to kneel during the national anthem, then you hate our troops. You're disrespecting her. And nothing I could say to help them see that those two ideas are not logically connected, because at this point, logic is completely and totally irrelevant. So I just saw an erosion of dialogue that we need to take seriously, and it's not marginal, right? It's like everybody around me, and there was nothing I could do to communicate. The hope that I know everybody wants to hear is that I was able to communicate and get through with some of my students through aesthetic interventions, right? And I study and work in hip hop culture and underground, what we might call conscious hip hop, which is still very much devoted to breaking down what is actually going on the level of relations of power, of relations of like white supremacy over capital and power, right? Or how classism works, or how misogyny is related to all of this. There's been such an incredible steady drum of underground hip hop resisting Donald Trump. And also it's spoken in a language that opposes the dominant discourse and the entire sensibility created by the dominant discourse and the way we talk and don't talk about systemic anti-Black violence. The media is constantly minimizing anti-Black violence as a series of tragic accidents, right? As opposed to patterns of foreseeable and entirely preventable forms of violence, right? That are exercised through the law, that are exercised through everyday practices and bureaucracies in all of our major institutions. So I think aesthetic interventions will be really important, but I think it's really important that we not minimize like how many Americans, right, are ready to support someone who promises that they never, ever, ever have to think about what white supremacy means, that they literally never have to think about that structure of oppression that Alex was talking about. That's critical. Just think about what it means to live in this country as a white person. Also, Ta-Nehisi Coates has said everything that I'm saying in his brilliant article, The Case for Reparations. That guy, my God, if you want to know how to just revamp the entire American educational system, if you want to know how to change all of our discursive practices about slavery, just like Ta-Nehisi Coates, like Director of Education, he really has already summed up all of this. But thank you so much. And thank you, Senator Neal, so much for being here. It is an honor and thrilled to hear everything. And you know, we'll get there eventually, but can't underestimate the threat.
I'm gonna buy your book.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, really, it just came out. Wow, so honored. I'm dying. I'm dying.
Alex, forget about the 2 minutes. Just give a brief.
Okay, I'll give my fortune cookie version. I'll just say that you know, it's every great struggle, every great time of conflict is a time of great revealing too. And so many of the myths that have comforted the powerful and have allowed a complex political economy that's always been predicated on incredible devastation of human and non-human life to continue, many of those things are increasingly threadbare. And apocalypse doesn't mean the end of all things. It means a great revealing. So my hope is that in this time we will learn the lessons of anti-fascist struggle and great liberation struggles of the past, and understand that we organize neighborhood to neighborhood, person to person, to build a society that is intolerant of fascism and of other pernicious, oppressive, and exploitative forms of being. And it's not too late for us to envision that and build that, but we are running out of time. Thanks.
And I'll give Dr. Saney the last word, but my hope is that you cannot kill human agency. And I have faith in the youth and resistance and resilience. I would like to thank, and Dr. Saney, you're gonna have the last word, but before you do, I'd like to thank the people who participated on this, all the panelists. I'd like to talk Riel, who at the last minute agreed to be our technological person and who's running the Zoom for us, and Amina, who helped with the flyer, and who's here with me helping with the Q&A. Dr. Saney, I would like to also thank you. You're the one who initiated all of this. It was supposed to be your project. I'm not sure how it ended up my project, but thank you for initiating this, and I will give you the last word.
Well, I'd just like to build on what Alex was saying. I think you know, this is both a dangerous time, but an opportunity for change. We could end up with an authoritarian fascist result, but we could end up also with a better society, a society fit for human beings with greater justice. As we were talking about, for example, Dr. Brickner and Senator and others were talking about, and Dr. Skitolsky and others were talking about these different forms of struggle that are resisting these reactionary forms that want to return us back to a horrible past, a past when people did not have rights. I was thinking that we also forgot that during the Trump years, while we were talking about the George Floyd protests and the multi-ethnic nature of them, we should also remember that Trump targeted Venezuela, Bolivia, and Cuba. He has failed to overturn the legitimate government, I would argue, of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. He initiated a coup against Bolivia, against Evo Morales, the indigenous president. And the people in a few months ago, he overturned that coup massively in an election, right? And reasserted their right as indigenous people, as Bolivians, to control their destiny. In the last 4 years, Trump has initiated over 230 measures against Cuba, against the Cuban people. The US economic blockade, the economic war against Cuba has never been more cruelly and zealously prosecuted. Yet Cuba has been resilient. And in fact, Cuba has led the world in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 4,000 Cuban medical personnel are now serving, and the last count, in 39 countries, and have not only served in terms of medical assistance, but have also developed pharmaceuticals that have actually been very significant in combating the pandemic itself, in treating it, and also 4 vaccines in trial. And it's good to know that on Biden's Corona Task Force, there were at least 3 people who have openly praised Cuba's healthcare system and Cuba's medical internationalism. So I think those are important sites of resilience. I'd like to end by actually reading the last paragraph of an article I wrote yesterday to mark Martin Luther King Day. And I concluded my article by saying, in the last year of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, which sought to achieve a fairer and more equitable society through a united movement of Black and white workers, a collective struggle of all the exploited and oppressed in the United States. This reflected his analytical appreciation of the interconnection of racism, oppression, inequality, and capitalism. The goal, the promised land, was the creation of a better world, one fit for human beings. The promised land has yet to be reached, and for some envisioned. Nevertheless, the struggle for a better world endures. And I am optimistic, especially as a father of a young daughter, that the struggle will eventually be victorious.
Great. And I think it's great that we ended with the words of Martin Luther King. For the audience out there, thank you for being there. I am sorry if we didn't get to all your questions, but hopefully parts of it were answered in the responses. The specific questions that if any of the panelists would like to respond to, feel free to do so. The session is recorded and will be posted once we convert it to a YouTube version at the website of my office, the Office of the Vice-Provost for Equity and Inclusion, Human Rights and Equity Services. So good night, and I think we'll have to have a part 2 should we give Biden and the flow of what's going to happen a couple months, and we'll reconvene, and hopefully Senator Neal will be able to join us and respond to some of what has happened in the next couple months. So to everyone, I would also like for us to pause as we leave to think about all those who have died because of COVID-19, and a special shout out to all the frontline workers and medical people who are dealing with this unprecedented situation. And please stay safe and be well so that we could reconvene in about a couple months from now. Take care.
And thank you, Theresa, for being an indefatigable banner bearer of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice at Dalhousie. Thank you for your efforts.
Yeah. You're welcome. My pleasure. Take care. Bye.
All right.